Chinua Achebe's short story, Vengeful Creditor, is a sharp social satire that explores class divisions, hypocrisy, education, and inequality in post-independence Nigeria, and critiques the consequences of government policies aimed at reducing poverty. The story begins in a wealthy, urban Nigerian household, with Mrs. Emenike, a well-off woman who is lamenting the sudden shortage of domestic servants. Her peers are similarly complaining. Many maids, houseboys, and other workers have quit their jobs to enroll in school after the government announced a free education policy for all citizens. Though the policy is intended to uplift the poor, it has had an unexpected effect. Wealthy households are now struggling to find affordable help. Mrs. Emenike is deeply frustrated by this shift. She considers the poor to be ungrateful and irresponsible, unable to appreciate their place in society. While her irritation appears comic at first, it quickly reveals her elitist mindset. She sees education not as a tool for empowerment but as a nuisance when it interferes with her comfort. She and her husband, Mr. Emenike, a government minister, hold conflicting views. Mr. Emenike supports the free education policy in public, after all, it's his government's program, but privately agrees with his wife that it was poorly implemented and disruptive. The story uses this contradiction to expose the hypocrisy of the political elite, who claim to serve the people while protecting their own privileges. Eventually, one of their old servants, Veronica, returns to the Emenike household asking for a job. She had left earlier to attend school but had to drop out when the policy failed. The government could not sustain the free education program due to budget issues, and students like Veronica were left stranded. For Veronica, returning to domestic service is not just a setback, it is a shameful defeat, and she blames the wealthy for crushing her hopes. Mrs. Emenike hires her, happy to have a servant again, but keeps a close watch on her. She suspects Veronica of being too proud, too clever, and perhaps even dangerous because she has tasted education. Veronica is indeed different. She's more confident, more observant, and more aware of the inequities of her position. The tension between her and Mrs. Emenike builds. As time passes, Veronica becomes close to the Emenike children, especially the younger ones. She is kind to them and works diligently, but something about her quiet confidence continues to irritate Mrs. Emenike, who sees it as insolence. Veronica is no longer the submissive housemaid. She is a girl who once dreamed of a better life and still carries that frustration beneath her calm demeanor. The story takes a tragic turn when Mrs. Emenike discovers that Veronica has poisoned one of the children, killing the child. The motive is never fully revealed in the text, but the implication is clear. Veronica's resentment, her crushed aspirations, and the cruelty of the system pushed her to a desperate act. Mrs. Emenike is devastated but also confused. She never expected that someone like Veronica could harbor such rage. To her, the poor were simply tools, not people with emotions, dreams, or capacity for vengeance. The title, Vengeful Creditor, is symbolic. It suggests that the poor are not simply passive recipients of aid, but people who remember debts, broken promises, and injustices. Veronica represents that silent creditor, someone who demands repayment for all the humiliation, exploitation, and disappointment she has endured. Themes and analysis: social inequality and class conflict. Achebe paints a vivid portrait of class divisions in post-colonial Nigeria. The wealthy, like the Emenikes, live in comfort, shielded from the realities of the poor. They treat domestic workers as inferior and view their ambitions, like pursuing education, as a threat. The story critiques how wealth is often built on exploiting the labor and dignity of the poor. Veronica's character exposes the emotional and psychological toll of such inequality. Her tragedy is not just personal. It represents the collective frustration of a marginalized class whose hopes are raised and then crushed by a careless system. The failure of social reform. Achebe also critiques the government's failure to implement free education effectively. Though well-intentioned, the policy was hastily introduced and poorly managed. It disrupted the social order without providing lasting support for those who left their jobs to enroll. In doing so, it created resentment, disillusionment, and chaos. This reflects a broader commentary on post-independence governments, which often struggle to balance modern reforms with practical infrastructure. Hypocrisy of the elite. Mr. and Mrs. Emenike represent the two faces of the ruling class. Mr. Emenike supports progressive policies in public to maintain his image, but privately he mocks them. Mrs. Emenike is more honest in her disdain for the poor but lacks empathy and understanding. Their privilege blinds them to the real consequences of their actions and attitudes. The Emenike's treatment of Veronica is emblematic of how the upper class uses people until they become inconvenient or threatening. Female voices and empowerment. Veronica stands out as a strong, if tragic, female character. She dares to seek education, independence, and dignity. Though her story ends in violence, Achebe gives her depth and complexity. She is not a stereotype of the passive poor girl. She is a person with memory, pain, and agency. Her final act, though horrifying, forces the reader to confront the human cost of exploitation. Conclusion. Vengeful Creditor is one of Achebe's most poignant and politically charged stories. With wit, irony, and a tragic twist, Achebe exposes the flawed structure of social reforms, the hypocrisies of the elite, and the smoldering resentment of the oppressed. Through Veronica's story, he warns that the poor are not merely background characters in the lives of the wealthy, they are watching, remembering, and demanding justice in their own way. The story is not just about one act of violence, it is about the system that made it inevitable. Achebe invites readers to think critically about charity, reform, and the deep wounds of inequality that surface when dignity is denied.